We're back. It's the Sega Swingin Report Show. Get ready for Sega news and commentary with George and Barry. Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Sega Swingin Report Show. I'm Barry, and I'm going to be going solo tonight. George is off in the fantasy zone looking for Opa Opa. But right now, we have a very special guest joining us, Mr. Tom Zito of Digital Pictures. So without further ado, let's give him a call. This is the Sega Swingin Report Show. I'm Barry. I'm the admin and editor, writer. I do a lot of duties at segabits.com. And joining us, we have Tom Zito of Digital Pictures, a co-founder working on several full-motion video game productions, including Corpse Killer, Supreme Warrior, the Make My Video series, and Night Trap, and many more. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Barry. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I really am interested in just the history of Digital Pictures and Night Trap, and as well as Night Trap ReVamped, which is a Kickstarter project to relaunch Night Trap for modern platforms, featuring high-quality sound and video. I believe that's an adequate description, yeah?
I think it's a perfect description, yes.
So I guess to begin, I wanted to go back in time to the Control Vision, or the NEMO.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about that platform?
Absolutely. So, and I'm going to date myself in doing so. Thanksgiving weekend of 1985.
Wow.
I had been working for about 5 or 6 months with Nolan Bushnell, the guy who putatively invented Pong, although in point of fact, Al Alcorn, who was an engineer who worked with Nolan, was actually the guy who created Pong, but Nolan certainly took credit for creating Pong. I had moved to California to help Nolan start a kind of high-tech toy company. The name of the company was Axlon, and that holiday season, that Thanksgiving of 1985, was starting up. Axlon was selling a couple of products. We had a product called AG Bear, which was a plush bear, teddy bear, that had some electronics in it, so that when you talked to the bear, it would kind of mumble back to you in a seemingly articulated speech pattern, although it was just mumbles.
Mm-hmm.
And we also had a little robotic cat that was called Petster. And we actually did $9 million worth of business in our first year of operation, which was fantastic for a startup company. But I was in New York Thanksgiving weekend. I had gone back to the East Coast to visit my family, and I was and still am a fairly avid photographer. Mm-hmm. And I had gone into a photography shop in New York called Willoughby's. Willoughby's was at the time the biggest retail location where you could buy photographic equipment in New York. I mean, it has since been enormously eclipsed by B&H Photo, but at the time, Willoughby's was the place to go. And I mean, when I say at the time, this is a time before blogs. This is a time before reviews on Amazon. So if you wanted to connect with other photographers and learn about what was new and interesting. You had to show up in a physical place and talk with people.
I remember that. I remember doing that.
And on this particular Saturday, after Thanksgiving, there was an enormous crowd of teenage boys in Willoughby's, which I found very odd because you never saw teenage boys in Willoughby's. It just never happened. And I kind of worked my way across the store, and lo and behold, here were kids lining up to play Mario Brothers on the NES. And I was surprised for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the main reasons I was surprised was because it had only been kind of 2 years since Atari had gone down in flames. And, you know, Atari had taken with it a number of companies that had been making entertainment software for various Atari platforms. And the other thing that I found surprising about the NES was that the graphics didn't seem to me to be a kind of enormous advance over what had been available on Atari platforms. And, you know, I have spent a lot of time over the last 29 years trying to figure out what it was that made Nintendo successful when Atari had failed. And the only possible solution that I was ever able to come up with was that Miyamoto was just so good at designing games that the graphics weren't that important. I mean, this was a guy who just was at the top of his game and knew how to make games that were really, really appealing to gamers. Anyway, 1985 was the introduction of the NES to the U.S. It had been in the Japanese market for a season or two already by then, and they were only selling them in the New York market. My recollection, Barry, is that they were only going to sell about 100,000 units. They had 100,000 units allocated to sell in New York, and it was pretty obvious watching these kids on the day after Thanksgiving, or 2 days after Thanksgiving, the day after so-called holiday shopping season begins in earnest, that they were going to sell those 100,000 with no problem. So I bought one to bring back to California, but I thought there was probably a better way to design a video game system. I didn't really know at the time whether it was possible to do it, but it seemed to me that if you could combine and I'm going to put the word graphics in quotes here, if you could combine the kind of graphics that you have on TV or on a VCR with gameplay, you would have a really different, interesting kind of platform for gaming. So I flew back to California on Sunday. On Monday morning, we had our weekly staff meeting. I showed everybody in the staff meeting the NES, and I suggested that we should develop a new game system that would that would connect between a VCR and a television and allow people to interact with real images as opposed to computer-generated images. And there was a lot of chatter in the room when I said this, but Nolan kind of shut it down and said to me, "See me in my office after the meeting." So I went to Nolan's office, and Nolan very presciently said to me, "Listen, what you were proposing in there was fundamentally turning this company into a movie studio. And, we can't do that. And, I mean, in many ways, Nolan was right, because the biggest reason that startup companies fail is that they lose focus. But he said to me, I'll tell you this, you probably didn't even realize it, but you were proposing something very, very interesting in the midst of everything that you were saying. And then he said, you can think of the VCR that is in most people's homes as a kind of mass storage device. And if we made traditional video games, but rather than putting the code on cartridges, we put the code on VCR tapes, we could beat everybody on price, because, the cost in 1985 to a third-party developer to have Nintendo manufacture cartridges for you was somewhere between $20 and $30.
Yeah.
And then the game went on the market for between $39 and $49. Nolan's thinking was that we could make a VCR tape for $1, and if we sold games for $10, we'd be way ahead of the game. And it was a very interesting business idea, but unfortunately, it was not something that I was terribly interested in spearheading the creation of. So and then at the end of this long conversation, Nolan said, listen, we don't have the money to do this, so if you really want to do this, you need to go find money. And I then spent, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but I then spent months trying to find some company that was interested in bankrolling the development of this system. And after a lot of fits and starts, Hasbro decided that they were interested in doing it, because now we got to go back in time a little bit. I mean, when the Atari VCS, the video computer system, the original sort of Pong machine, when that thing came out, and then successively through the Atari 2600 and all the other gaming systems, they sucked an enormous amount of disposable dollars out of the toy business. And so Hasbro is very smart in saying, hey, Nintendo is probably going to clean our clock again, and we would be wise to sort of get on board and have a system of our own. So Hasbro wound up bankrolling the system. They initially gave us $2 million to develop a prototype. We made, in addition to doing some prototype hardware, we made this little game called Scene of the Crime, which was kind of a precursor of Night Trap. And Scene of the Crime, all you could do was switch around a house and look in different rooms and try to figure out who had broken into a safe in a house while a party was going on. I mean, Scene of the Crime was created by Jim Riley and Rob Fulop, the same two people who were responsible for Night Trap.
Oh, wow.
And the guys at Hasbro were just delighted with how Scene of the Crime turned out, and basically wanted to move forward. Now, again, Barry, I don't know how much detail you want to go into.
Oh, this is fascinating. Go on.
So Nolan Nolan became really upset with me because and there's some truth to this. I mean, he felt like I had gone behind his back and had created this system that required us to go out and make movies. And he didn't want that to happen. And he fired me. He called me up on a Saturday, asked me to come down at his house, read me the riot act, and fired me. And now I was in this very awkward position of having to call up Barry Alperin, the guy who I dealt with at Hasbro. Barry was the general counsel at Hasbro. And I said, hey, Barry, I got some bad news. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, I just got fired. And he said, well, you know, we've been doing some talking here, and that actually might be good news. I'm going to fly out to California tomorrow, and we'll see how this plays out. So fundamentally what happened was that Barry came out and wanted me to leave Axlon and head up a new division of Hasbro that was going to develop the NEMO system. And as is often said in business, there's no problem that can't be solved with money. So Hasbro paid Axlon some sum of money, and Nolan, somewhat begrudgingly, but with his pockets stuffed, allowed me, Rob, and Jim, along with one other then employee of Axlon, a guy named Jim Simmons, the four of us left to start this wholly owned subsidiary of Hasbro that wound up being named ISIX. And the first time that I went to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which is where Hasbro's headquarters is located, George Dunsey, who was the vice president of R&D at Hasbro, came into me. I'm sorry, he was the senior vice president of technology, and he said to me, well, he said, the boys and I have been sitting around trying to decide what your title ought to be, and you're going to be Senior VP of Technology for Hasbro. And I said, George, I don't know anything about technology. I mean, you know, I'm a former journalist. I'm not an engineer. And George said to me, you don't understand. At Hasbro, technology means 2 D cells. So first I became Senior Vice President of Technology at Hasbro, which was a title that I had for about 6 months. And then we finished the incorporation of this other company that was called ISIX, and we basically spent the next 18 months building a prototype of the NEMO box. I mean, a prototype that was ready to be manufactured, and making 2 pieces of software that were ostensibly going to be ready for the launch of the platform, namely Night Trap and Sewer Shark. And the other thing that we were doing in that period of time was we were building some development units and seeding those units to a few third parties so that they could start thinking about making software for the NEMO system. And probably in the last 6 to 9 months, I spent most of my time in Japan trying to find some company that was going to manufacture the hardware for us. We wound up signing an agreement with Toshiba. But one of the things that happened from 1986 to over the course of period from, say, mid-86 to fall of 87 was that the price of RAM, specifically video RAM, just kept going up and up and up and up and up. So Stephen Hassenfeld, who's now dead, but at the time was the CEO of Hasbro, had made an edict that, I'd have to look it up, Barry, but his edict was that we had to be able to build this box either for $100 or $120. I don't remember what the upper end limit was, right. But the point of the limit was that he believed that the box had to be on the shelf for $199, or we were going to be in major trouble. And the price of video RAM basically went from about $20 to somewhere around $80 or $100, and it pushed the cost of the hardware almost to $200.
Oh man!
There was no way we could get it on the shelf for $200. This is now fall, winter of 87. There is something called the American International Toy Fair that happens roughly the first week of February in New York every year. And it's when toy manufacturers show off their line of products for the upcoming holiday season. Hasbro had to make a decision about whether it was going to show NEMO, which by this time we had named Control Vision. The name was actually created by an ad agency, Goodby, Berlin, and Silverstein. Yeah, it's now called Goodby Silverstein. Andy Berlin has long since left the agency, but they did a lot of focus groups. They found that the real appeal of the system was that people felt that they were controlling reality.
Okay.
So they came up with this name, Control Vision, which was a pretty good name. And, Stephen Hassenfeld had a very tough decision to make in the fall of 87. Do we show this product or do we walk away from it? And I don't know if the net revenue at Hasbro for 86 or 87 was about $250 million. The company is much bigger now, although at the time Hasbro was the largest toy company in the world. That's no longer true. Lego is now the largest toy company in the world. But it was going to, by their estimates, it was to manufacture inventory and market and sell this product, they were going to need to put about $250 million at risk, and they didn't want to do that. And I think, if I had been the CEO, I probably would have made the same decision. And so they basically closed the company down, put all the stuff in storage, and that was the end of that. So that's now fall of 87. We now flash forward to roughly spring of 1991.
Wow, that's a big jump. What did you do in between?
Let's see. What did I do in between? I was a writer on a TV show for a season.
Which one? You got to tell me.
It was not a very good show. It was a 1-hour dramatic show on ABC that was called Capital News.
Oh, wow.
And it was a sort of it was a kind of thinly veiled dramatic presentation about the newsroom of the Washington Post,
okay,
where I had been a reporter for about 12 years.
Oh wow!
And it was created by Christian Williams, who was a guy who had been my editor for a while at the Washington Post, and David Milch, who was the creator of NYPD Blue, who would later create Deadwood, and who most recently, who then did John from Cincinnati, and then he had a show on HBO last year about horse racing that actually got pulled because a number of horses got killed while they were shooting the show. But very creative guy. And, we made 13 episodes of the show, a 1 hour TV show for broadcast television is about 42 minutes an episode. Lloyd Bridges.
I was going to say, I'm looking here right now, Lloyd Bridges. It's an impressive cast.
Lloyd Bridges from Sea Hunt played the editor of the newspaper. But ABC pulled it after three airings because it just didn't get news. So I did that. Let's see, what else did I do? I think that was pretty much what I did. Work on that TV show. So now it's early 1991, and Ken Melville, who was the creator of Sewer Shark. I'm at home in San Francisco, and I get a call from Ken Melville, who had created Sewer Shark, and he was working at a game company in Southern California called Cinemaware. And I can't remember the titles that Cinemaware made. They were very high resolution CD-ROM games. And Ken called me up and he said, "You're not going to believe what's happening right now." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, Mickey Shuloff was the CEO of Sony USA. Mickey Shuloff and Peter Gruber. Peter was the head of Columbia Pictures, which Sony had recently to that acquired. He said, Mickey Shuloff and Peter Gruber are in the next office, and they are trying to buy this company because they want to acquire Sewer Shark. And I said, Ken, that just sounds impossible to believe. I mean, I just can't believe that a big company like Sony would want to acquire a little software company to get a piece of software. And I said, on top of that, the minute they start doing their diligence, they're going to very quickly discover that Cinemaware doesn't own that title. But it just sounded so ridiculous that I couldn't believe anything like this could happen. So it just so happened that my brother worked for Mickey Shuloff in New York. So I called my brother and I said, "Hey, Bob, this is going to sound completely crazy to you, but I just got a call from a former colleague telling me that Mickey and Peter are trying to buy a game that, some colleagues of mine and I made 5 years ago." And my brother laughed and said, "Yeah, that's totally ridiculous." Well, 15 minutes later, my phone rings, and my brother said, does this have something to do with trying to shoot rats in a sewer? And I said, as a matter of fact, it does. And he said, you better get on a red eye and come to New York. So, again, to make a very long story short, and after having to sign non-disclosure agreements up the yin-yang, Sony explained to me that they were trying to develop a video game console in concert with Nintendo. And that they and Nintendo had decided that the way to make this console seem unique would be to have games that were fundamentally interactive movies. And somehow they had heard about this thing that Cinemaware had. And so they had gone out to try to acquire it. So, I mean, I let, Sony at the time, they may still be, I don't know, but Sony had offices on 57th Street in New York, just west of Fifth Avenue. I walked out of the meeting at Sony, got in a cab, went down to 23rd Street, where Hasbro had its offices in Manhattan. Barry Alperin, the guy that I had reported in through at Hasbro when I was working at ISIX, was still there. And I said, "Hey, Barry, listen, I'd like to license the rights to the games and the technology we develop, because I think there may be an opportunity for you and for us to make some money." So I licensed the technology back from Hasbro along with the games. And we then spent... Barry, did I say 90 or 91?
I believe you said 91.
Okay, so this is 1990. I apologize.
That's all right.
Yeah. We then spent about a year working with both Nintendo and Sony to try to help them develop this game platform that could deliver interactive movies, FMV titles, before anybody had ever heard of any such thing. And, after a while, and it was a very slow process, and it was interesting as an observer who was kind of, an independent third party to watch the battles between Nintendo and Sony. So, for example, it was very, very hard for Sony to convince Nintendo that the medium of distribution ought to be discs rather than cartridges, because Nintendo just, not only had that been their medium of exchange forever, but it was a huge profit center for them. And they couldn't imagine how you could get third parties to spend between $20 and $30 to manufacture a DVD, a CD. It wasn't even a DVD then. But Sony wanted. Now, let me also say that this is pre-MPEG. So there really are, at this point, no formally established ways that you can deliver digital video. So Sony had ideas about what's the right way to deliver video, and I will tell you that both of them probably spent more time focused on how are we going to make sure that people can't duplicate these discs than probably any other topic. But and then there was there was the classic issue of who's going to control this joint venture, blah blah blah. And after a while, it just got very untenable. I mean, so the way that was going to work was, had this happened, Sony was going to put out Sewer Shark. Nintendo was going to put out Night Trap at the launch of this new platform. And after about 9 months or a year of our involvement, we just watched the whole thing come tumbling down. And it was then, in probably spring of '91, that Sony introduced us to Sega. We had never met anyone from Sega.
Oh, wow.
Before. And, and again now, under major non-disclosure, Sega told us that they were going to come out with this CD add-on to Genesis. And they thought that FMV titles would be a great way to launch Sega CD. And so we then began focusing on developing titles for Sega CD. And it was a real challenge because Genesis had a palette of 64 colors, and trying to make video when you only have 64 colors is extremely challenging, to put it mildly. And the bandwidth of the CD player was not that great. So, I mean, we could do full motion video, but as you well know, and anybody who had a Sega CD or anybody who's ever seen Sega CD, it was really the quality and the amount of video you could put up on the screen off a Sega CD was minimal at best. So, boy, Barry, you've asked me one question, and we've taken about 30 minutes.
Oh, that knocked out a lot of questions that I had. It was a really amazing just journey from the NEMO through to Digital Pictures. I wanted to ask who named the studio? Like, how did the founding come about?
So 6 of us. When you say the studio, you presumably mean Digital Pictures.
Did you consider yourselves a studio?
Yeah, we probably did in some way.
Because, sorry to interrupt. It's just...
No, you go ahead.
I mean, it's part movie studio, part game developer. So was it a challenge combining the two? Did you approach it as a video game company, or did you say, all right, well, we can kind of start, since we're starting from scratch, maybe we can create something that hasn't existed before?
That is a great question, and I think the correct answer to that question is that I don't think we knew. And here's what I mean by that. That day in 1985, the Monday after Thanksgiving in 1985, when I walked into the staff meeting at Axel, Nolan's toy company, I had relatively little interest in developing a new video game system. What intrigued me was the notion of interactive TV. I really believe that if we could get enough NEMO boxes into households, that they would kind of act as a Trojan horse and allow us to unleash on the world this, if I want to be self-deprecating, I'll say half-baked idea. If I want to be less self-deprecating, I'd say this nation idea for what would it be like if we had interactive TV. Now, the way that I was thinking about interactive TV in 1985, let me take a step back. Probably 5 years before this, Tim Berners-Lee had come up with the idea of hyperlinked data. Really the sort of the genesis of the web, even though there really wouldn't be browsers and there wouldn't be any websites you could go to until the early 90s. I mean, I literally remember the day that I first downloaded my first browser, which was Mozilla, and there were about 7 websites you could go to. It was pretty limited. So I had no idea that he had already proposed something like this. But in the course of going around and trying to find investors for NEMO, the closest I ever got was to this then tiny little joint venture between 2 companies, one of whom doesn't even exist anymore, Capital Cities Communications, which used to own ABC in New York, mm-hmm. and the Hearst Corporation, which obviously still exists. They had this little operation which had not yet become the amazing barn burner that it is now, ESPN. Mm-hmm. And Steve Bornstein, who had been brought in to run ESPN, had spent some time in, I can't remember whether it was Cincinnati or Ohio or Columbus, Ohio or Akron, Ohio, but Warner, before it was Time Warner, mm-hmm. had done this experiment with interactive television called Cube in Ohio. And Cube was actually the first time you could have any kind of on-demand movie. And, that in and of itself was so revolutionary at that time that they considered that interactive TV. But Steve, who had worked at Cube and had been recruited in to run ESPN, he bought into the notion of interactive television in a big way. And when I met with Steve, he thought that he could extract $40 a month more from ESPN subscribers if, while they were watching a sporting event, they could choose what kind of statistics to bring up on the screen rather than the guy in the truck who was putting the chyron on the screen. And so he got it. I had spoken at some point with some people who were, and this was trying to get titles made for NEMO. I'd spoken to some writers who worked on soap operas. And they thought that, so what they told me about people who watch soap operas, I'm not among them, but what they told me was that what makes people stay engaged with soap operas is that they like to see how characters that they either love or despise react when they wind up in different situations. And so I thought, boy, what if you could allow the viewer to decide what kind of situations to put characters into? And I thought, what if you could, while you're watching a newscast, if there's something that you find interesting, what if you could go deeper into that? So look, I had, and I learned this later, but I mean, I had no idea that, what the cost of this would be. But I really wanted, what I was really interested in was trying to create interactive TV. So now we flash forward to digital pictures. I mean, so 6 of us who had been at ISIX started digital pictures. And, I think we all were in agreement that at least for the foreseeable future, we were in the games business. We were in the full motion video games business. But for me, the big win would have been if we could have figured out some way to get into the interactive TV business. And I'll tell you that at some point back in the digital pictures days, John Malone, who ran Liberty Media, which was a big cable operator, he saw some of our products, and he had me go out on this road show with him, painting the future of cable as being the future of interactive TV. It never happened, but at least somebody else thought that this might be an interesting idea. I mean, the problem with creating interactive television, frankly, is that it's really, really expensive. And, we at one point we sort of said, okay, look, we got to try to figure out some way to corral our costs here. We can't spend $2 or $3 million every time we want to make a title, although, flash forward to now,
right.
And EA wants to make a new title, and they spend $150 million. But back then, the notion of spending $2 or $3 million every time you wanted to make a show was kind of nuts. And we did one experiment to see if there was some way to significantly reduce those costs, and that was we went to Paramount and we licensed the rights to every Star Trek movie, every episode of Star Trek on television, to see if there was some way to cut all that footage together. And it turned out that it was pretty impossible to do. In other words, even if you could do the visual equivalent of Mamma Mia, by which I mean, you take a bunch of ABBA songs and you wrap, you wrap some narrative around it so that you now have a Broadway show. Well, even if you could take all these pieces out of old Star Trek episodes, you still needed the wrapper that they had to get inserted in, and that in and of itself was expensive. Yeah. So I'll just say that coming back to the present, and then you can ask me anything you want. But coming back to the present, there were 2 reasons really that we were interested in trying to revive Night Trap. One was that over the last several years, Jim and Rob in particular, myself to some extent, had really been besieged by fans who said, hey, the only way you can play Night Trap is on some antiquated system, and digital video has gotten so much better. Can't you guys create a new version of the game? So that was one impetus. But the other impetus, in some ways, the bigger impetus, is that if you go back to NEMO and you think about where NEMO was going to sit in the house and how NEMO was going to be used, although it was engineered to sit between a VCR and a TV set, it could also just as easily have sat between a cable box.
Yeah.
TV set. And in fact, I cannot remember the name, but the only person that ever actually wound up licensing the technology itself from Hasbro was a Canadian television broadcaster that would allow you, while you were watching hockey games, to switch the camera that you were watching the game from rather than having the guy in the truck switch the camera.
That's impressive.
So, yeah, and a very early and perhaps the only real example of interactive television. But my point is this. Most of us, back in the early days, really thought about NEMO as this is how we're going to get into interactive TV. We never thought of NEMO games as being things like Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog or, later in the early 90s, Doom. We didn't think of them as high-twitch games. We thought of them as interactive movie experiences. And I often say that it was what I refer to as the tyranny of the platform, by which I mean gaming platforms, Sega CD, 3DO, blah, 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 that kind of doomed digital pictures. Because, if there was from one perspective at least, valid criticism made of our games, it was that they did not have the kind of interactivity that lots of other console games had. And I think that now, in 2014, and for the last few years, for that matter, this whole area of casual gaming is much more conducive to the acceptance of FMV games than was the era of console games. So that was the other reason we thought it might be wise to try to put Night Trap out again, because there was now, in fact, a proven market for games that people played in a much less testosterone-charged environment than lives in the console gaming room.
And plus the hurdle's gone, too, of the small video on the screen and the pixelation.
Very true. Yeah, very true. Yeah, so pretty much any platform now has native support for really good digital video. Although I will tell you one thing. I'm a huge movie buff. In fact, when I got out of high school, I thought what I wanted to be was a movie director, like probably 10% of the kids in the world, not having any idea what that meant. I just thought I wanted to direct movies, and I went to film school for one semester and left because I just thought that this was not for me. I didn't like working with actors. My cinematography professor, who was Marty Scorsese, had seen 10 times more movies than I had seen, and I felt like I was never going to be able to catch up with him. So I had no business being in his business. But what I was going to say was that as great as DVDs are, because of my experience at Digital Pictures and because I just so painfully remember what all that stuff on Sega CD and even 3DO and then PC and Mac looked like, when I watch DVDs now, what I see are the digital artifacts in the video. I don't see the picture. I see the problems with the picture. So I still, even though it's become now hard to find movie theaters that project film, I still try to go see movies to the extent that I can projected off celluloid rather than
so digital. You can escape that digital world for a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, that's funny. So I was curious with with Night Trap, is it going to be 2K, 4K? What's the resolution that you're aiming for?
Well, I can't. Here's what I can tell you. We have a 4K scan of the film of Night Trap. The resolution that we put the game out will vary from platform to platform based on the amount. Let me try to answer this question a different way with a historical analogy. In the early 80s, when Sony and Philips were developing the audio CD, there were huge debates within Sony and Philips about what the sample rate ought to be for audio CDs. And the debate was solved in a very, very strange way by the man who was then the CEO of Sony. He was an amateur opera singer and loved classical music. And what he told the engineers was that they had to be able to fit the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven on one disc, which in some ways was a very smart way to think about solving a problem, and in other ways was a really stupid way to think about solving a problem. So, Ninth Symphony of Beethoven is about 72 minutes, so you just do the division, and the sample frequency they came up with was this very bizarre 44.1 kilohertz. Turns out that was a horrible, horrible, horrible sample frequency to choose, because it turns out that it's not a frequency that is very friendly to the ear. If they had picked, for example, 48K, CDs would have sounded much better, much richer, much less harsh than they do to a lot of people. But then they wouldn't have been able to fit the Ninth Symphony on one disc. So, similarly, we got an enormous amount of criticism for putting Night Trap on 2 discs. So, when we were debating what's the video resolution going to be, I said, you know what? I'm going to be an asshole, and I'm going to, just like Norio Oga, and say, we got to be able to fit Night Trap on one DVD.
Okay.
Now, depending on the platform, DVD can hold more or less data. So what we're going to do on the 4 platforms that we have announced that we're going to support is make the smallest possible user interface around the video window so that the video window will be as big as we can possibly make it.
Good.
And then the video resolution will be whatever we can fit on the disc. So the game will be 1080p, 30 frames per second. But I can't tell you what. I mean, it's really the resolution is not the issue here. The issue is the bit rate. I can't tell you what the bit rate will be until we actually do it, and it will be different for each platform because each platform is able to handle DVDs in different ways. Right. A lot of people have asked us about developing for Wii U. We have applied to become Wii U developers. The interesting thing about the Wii is that we could probably have full screen 1080p 30 frame per second video running on a Wii, because we could put the interface on the controller pad.
That's true, yeah.
One of the things we also thought about was maybe letting people use an iPad or an Android device as an outboard controller device. But then as we started to think that through, the number of permutations that we would have to have tested just became too daunting. And we said, no, unless a system natively supports the ability to have an outboard user interface, we're not going to think about doing that.
Okay. And with the, I guess the 4:3 aspect ratio now in a 16:9 frame, is there any chance that maybe the video would be off to one side and the user display would be on the other side rather than below? But you know what I mean? Like, is there any plans to shift?
Well, we could certainly do that. The developer that we're working with has 2 artists assigned to this project, and I am generally loath to say to artists a priori, here's how you should do this. I mean, I want to see what kind of things they come up with, but I think the notion of having video on one side, and by the way, Jim Riley believes that he left enough space around the action in every scene that he shot. So if we wanted to move around the frame, we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking at the raw footage you put up there, and you see a lot of the living room carpet at the bottom there. So, yeah, you definitely left the space. I'm curious, too, can we expect any deleted scenes or additional material, or is this going to be the game as is?
Well, it's basically going to be the game as is, and it's fundamentally because there really weren't any deleted scenes, and I'll expand on that. When we made Scene of the Crime, which was sort of our inaugural journey into interactive filmmaking, what we discovered really, really quickly was that in many ways, shooting an interactive film is a lot more expensive than shooting a non-interactive film. So one of the things we learned from the Scene of the Crime experience was that the best way not to waste money is to have this extremely detailed design document that fundamentally maps out every single scene that you need to shoot in order to make a show. So the reality on Night Trap is that every scene that Jim shot was used in the show. Now, there are a few scenes that, because of some coding errors, never were displayed in the original version of the game. So that kind of stuff will be fixed. But there are, it's not like a Hollywood movie where in the process of editing, you discover that there's some, what are called B stories that you really want to take out of the movie, and you just cut all of that stuff out. And then when you put the DVD out, you stitch those things together and put them on the DVD. There isn't anything like that from Night Trap.
Okay. Is there any plans maybe to make the game maybe have an easy mode, or maybe a way that if you lose, you can jump back into this point you were at, like anything like that?
I don't want to say that they're plans, but certainly these are among the things that we have discussed with the developer about, how can we add functionality to the game.
Okay. And are there any plans for a digital release at all? And if there is, would this be covered by the Kickstarter campaign?
The answer is all of the above,
okay. Yes. Very cool. I'm also curious, just the evolution of the game, just stepping back in time a little bit. It appeared on several platforms, with the Sega CD onto the Sega 32X. Do you have any recollections of the of porting to the Sega 32X and working with that hardware?
You know what? I believe there was a 32X version of Night Trap, but I can't swear.
I do. I have it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We certainly did it for 3DO, and then we did it for Mac and PC. So those are all the platforms that we developed.
Okay, so in upgrading from the Sega CD to those, and then now those to this is almost like the third version or the third iteration of it.
Well, you could certainly say that. I mean, you could also say the fourth iteration if you consider NEMO to be the first generation.
That's true. I'm curious, too, now that video games are becoming more immersive than the hardware could ever reach in the 90s, are you satisfied with the technical achievements that the industry has accomplished to provide these cinematic experiences?
Well, yeah. Look, yes and no. I mean, as a guy who I said earlier, I'm a huge movie buff. Was probably from age 5. I mean, one of the defining moments of my youth was going to see the movie Lawrence of Arabia for the first time. I mean, it just knocked me out in terms of how you could use a visual medium to tell a story. So, to me, there is something about having actors on a screen that nothing else comes close to. So, I mean, I've played Call of Duty. I'm not very good at it, but I've played it. And while on the one hand, I would say that is an extraordinarily immersive experience. It for me at least is a very, very different experience than watching a film. Now, some people have criticized what we do. When I say what we do, I mean what we did at Digital Pictures. Because they think that, by definition, a storytelling experience should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you don't give that to the person that, in quotes, is listening to or watching the story, you're cheating them out of what it is that fundamentally defines a story.
Okay.
I happen not to believe that. When I remember as a kid going to the 1968 Toronto World's Fair. I believe it was the Czech government pavilion at the Toronto World's Fair that had what was claimed to be the first interactive movie that had ever been developed. And it was about 8 minutes long, and there were points in the plot where you had a switch on the back of the seat in front of you, and the audience basically voted. And there was back in the day of Digital Pictures, there was another company that tried to do something similar. I didn't find those to be terribly immersive experiences. If I have kind of one regret of the way things went down, so to speak, at Digital Pictures, my biggest regret is that we never got to release a game called Maximum Surge. Because Maximum Surge was a really, really interesting game that was, a narrative film, but it had, it was a narrative film combined with Doom. In other words, you could actually maneuver forward, backward, left, and right in a video world. And the guy who was the coder on that game, a guy named Gene Kuzmiak, far and away the greatest coder I've ever worked with. I mean, he basically figured out a way to combine video game technology with video editing technology and computer graphics imagery technology, so that on the fly, you were basically doing these special effects that gave you the sense that you were moving through a real video environment. It was an amazing product, and unfortunately, because of some things that were within our control and some things that were not within our control, Digital Pictures wound up being forced into bankruptcy. And as a result of that, Max never got released. But I think if people had seen Max, they would have been much less dubious about the real gaming prospects for FMV.
Is there any future for that abandoned game?
Well, it's possible. I mean, look, if this Kickstarter campaign is successful, and if it, if we are able to ultimately generate enough revenue from Night Trap ReVamped, the first thing that we want to do is go acquire rights to as many of the old Digital Pictures games as we are able to.
Cool.
We've talked a little bit. Jim has spent a lot of time actually thinking about what would Night Trap 2 be.
Oh, okay.
And he would love to make Night Trap 2, but we just need to see where all this goes.
And if you ever did make a Night Trap 2, would you use this same technology, or are you ever interested in using things like the new virtual reality headsets that are out there?
No, so if we were making Night Trap 1 today, first of all, there would have been many more traps in the house. But more importantly, we would not have had to have built mechanical traps. In other words, now you would be able to transition between digital OGs and real OGs, and real parts of the house and digital parts of the house. So, number one, we could have made Night Trap now for less money than it cost us to make it almost 30 years ago. And from the standpoint of what's happening on the screen, it would have been much more interesting. Interesting. It's probably maybe the wrong adjective to use. It would have been much more varied.
Okay.
So Jim has spent the last 20 years at a company called Stargate Studios. And what Stargate Studios has done is develop this whole concept of a digital backlot. And what that means is if you're doing a TV show and you want to have your TV show set in Paris. Stargate guys go to Paris and they film all these live video backdrops.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can then have your actors for the exteriors on blue screen.
Right.
And, I mean, it looks just like they're in Paris. So, if we were going to do modern FMV titles, that's one of the sorts of things that we would do.
Yeah, and it would also work to your advantage too, just because if you wanted to film a scene between two characters, you could have that scene take place inside or outside, which would just give you even more, I guess, possibilities with the narrative.
Absolutely. So, were someone to climb back into the full motion video game bandwidth, there are many more things you can do now than we were able to do back when we were doing this.
And I mean, I will say, like, as a consumer who I didn't have a Sega CD at the time, but I did get one, I believe, in the late 90s, and I started buying up a lot of the software. When I first experienced the FMV games, it was, there was a real novelty to it. But of course, you approach certain games like maybe Prize Fighter or what is that? The Far East fighting one. I can't recall the name.
Supreme Warrior.
Yeah. When you go into those, you go in thinking, all right, I'm playing a fighting game, but then you have to. I've learned that you have to kind of like backtrack and think, all right, I'm playing a full motion video fighting game. So there's a different way to go about it and approach it, and the manual especially is very important. I see people diving into Night Trap, and while they do walk through, people like hitting start, so they'll typically skip the most important stuff. So it's really, I think, to appreciate and to enjoy full motion video games and a lot of the digital pictures titles, you need to kind of retrain how you approach it. It's not just a fighting game, but it's a full motion video fighting game. Would you agree with that?
Supreme, yes, I do. And Supreme, by the way, of the games that we put out, Supreme Warrior was my favorite.
Oh, really? I picked that up just last week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm glad I picked that up. I'm going to have to play that a little bit more. I didn't really have time to get into it. But I'd say Supreme Warrior does feel the most like you are within the game. There was those the cuts between if you make contact with your opponent or if you don't. It's pretty seamless. It's impressive, especially on the 32X with the larger screen.
Yeah.
I was going to ask too. So that's one you're most proud of. Would that be one of the ones you would want to bring back?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Which one did you have the most involvement in too, creatively?
Barry, I'm not really. When it comes to games, I'm not a creative guy. So I kind of ran the company and let the creative people do what they needed to do.
Okay.
I mean, the person who was really the sort of the creative engine behind Supreme Warrior was a woman named Amanda Welsh.
Okay.
Or I guess that's her married name. So at the time, I guess she was using the name Amanda Latham, which is probably the name that's in the game.
Okay.
But, that was really her baby. She lived in Hong Kong for 6 months while we were making that show. And, it was shot at Shaw Brothers Studios, which is the oldest martial arts studio in China. And I went over to visit when they were shooting, and Ron Shaw was in his 90s. And he met me on the set and took me out to dinner. I mean, it was very magical.
That's nice. And I wanted to ask too, what's your most memorable moment at Digital Pictures at the time?
my most memorable moment? Well, it was probably a morning. I mean, memorable does not carry with it necessarily a positive or negative connotation. And I would probably say that my most memorable moment was one morning in December of 1993 when I was walking out of my apartment building in San Francisco and noticed that there was a big gaggle of journalists outside the door to my apartment. And I had no idea why all these people were out there. And it turned out that earlier that morning on the East Coast, Joe Lieberman had announced these Senate hearings on video game violence, and they had used this footage from Night Trap in the announcements. And so, unbeknownst to me, I was all of a sudden in the middle of a news cycle, which was actually a very painful experience.
Yeah. Would you say, though, it was a necessary one for the industry?
Yes and no. I mean,
I guess I'd say like ripping a Band-Aid off, or something that was coming to a head.
I felt very strongly all along when we were in business that there needed to be a rating system for video games, because my feeling was that absent a rating system, all video games sort of needed to be for kids, and I didn't want to see us meaning game developers in general, have to be limited to making games for kids. I thought there should be games for kids, and I thought there should be games for grown-ups.
Right.
And I thought there should be games for many different segments of the market, much as there are movies for different segments of the market. And so, in that sense, it's good that a rating system was created, but it should have been done before.
Yeah, and I mean, you were very much on the same page then as Tom Kalinske, who I'm sure you know.
I do.
I'm curious too. Did you know Al Nilsson at all? I know he worked at Hasbro during the NEMO era.
Yep, he was a product manager for us.
Okay, was he at all instrumental? I know you said Sony introduced you to Sega, but was he at all instrumental in any of the partnerships between you?
No, I mean, I met Al after
Okay.
that.
Okay. I was just curious because I know he spoke of NEMO rather fondly. So, so I guess
I've completely lost touch with Al Nilsson. I mean, what is he doing now?
He's actually he's doing well. He's been promoting the Console Wars book. I don't know if you got a chance to check that out yet. But he's kind of come back out. I believe he's consulting right now, but he's really been out there. He's did a panel at Comic-Con, which some of our writers attended and recorded. It's on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. It's Tom and Al and I think a few folks from Nintendo too, and the author of the book. But he's doing well. He's a really fun guy.
Great.
He's like a big kid.
He's a big kid. Yeah, very true.
I wanted to be respectful of your time, so if you just wanted to say anything to the Kickstarter backers out there, potential Kickstarter backers, is there any message that you wanted to send out to them?
Look, we're incredibly grateful to anybody who's backing this project, and it was really fans who were fundamentally instrumental in getting us to even consider doing this. And I hope for all of our sakes that we're successful at doing this, because we would love to see a number of these old games and maybe some new games come about as a result of this.
Awesome. Well, I wish you guys the best of luck.
Well, thank you, Barry. It's been delightful talking to you.
It's been amazing talking to you. Such great stories.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Tom. And again, that's the Night Trap ReVamped Kickstarter. It's going on now, and there's, I believe at the time of this, there's about 19 days left.
Great. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much, Tom. Take care.
You were perfect. Nobody's ever done that. I knew I could count on you.